The air in northern Florida hung heavy with salt and silence, broken only by the steady crash of waves against the barrier islands and the distant calls of herons stalking the marshes. It was 1856, and the land between the St. Johns River and the Atlantic coast existed in a peculiar state of tension, a borderland where the rigid structures of plantation slavery pressed against something older, something that refused to be fully contained. In the slave quarters of the Whitmore plantation, among weathered cabins that leaned like tired sentinels against the wind, a child was born who would become a whisper, then a legend, then a ghost story whispered to keep overseers awake at night. If you're drawn to tales of resistance from the darkest chapters of American history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories belong to all of us, and your presence matters. The midwife who delivered the child, a woman named Rue, whose hands carried the wisdom of 3 generations of healing, knew instantly that something was different. The birth occurred during a new moon, when darkness was complete, and the only light came from a single candle that refused to stay lit. 3 times Rue tried to ignite the wick, and 3 times an unseen wind snuffed it out, until finally she worked by touch alone, her fingers reading the contractions like braille, guiding the infant into a world with no place prepared for her. When the child emerged, she didn't cry. She merely opened her eyes, flecks of amber glinting even in the thick darkness, and stared at Rue with an intensity that made the old midwife's breath catch. The mother, Celia, had worked the Whitmore fields since she was 6. Her body bore the record of slavery's cruelties. Whip scars crisscrossed her back like a brutal map. Her hands were thickened and calloused from endless labor under the Florida sun, and her spirit had been eroded by a system designed to break human beings into tools. She had been bred, the Whitmores called it, as though she were livestock, to a man she barely knew, a field hand from a neighboring plantation brought for a single night. His role had been recorded in the plantation ledger with the same precision used to track the mating of horses. Celia, 22, bred to Caesar from Thornton property, expected yield, spring 1856. But when Celia held her daughter for the first time, something shifted in her resignation. The child's skin was darker than her own, a deep brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her tiny fingers gripped with surprising strength, and her eyes, Celia couldn't stop staring into them, seemed to harbor a wildness the plantation had yet to tame. In that moment, Celia felt a hope she thought had been extinguished years ago, a hope that this child might somehow escape the fate the plantation had predetermined before she drew her first breath. They named her Zora, after Celia's grandmother, born in Africa, who carried stories of a land where black people owned themselves, built cities, forged iron, and answered only to their own conscience. That grandmother practiced what the enslaved called Hoodoo, a system of folk magic, spiritual protection, and resistance that had survived the Middle Passage. She had read signs in nature, crafted protections from roots and bones, and called on ancestors to intervene in a world intent on crushing her people. Though she was sold away when Celia was young, taken south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, her legacy endured in whispered knowledge, healing, hiding, small acts of rebellion. Rue had known the grandmother, had learned at her feet traditions older than American slavery itself. Looking at this child born under such peculiar circumstances, Rue recognized the same power she had seen once before in Celia's grandmother, a connection to forces beyond the material world of cotton fields, auction blocks, and ledgers. From the earliest days, Zora was different. While other children learned to make themselves small, to avoid white attention, to move with eyes downcast, Zora could not. She walked tall, shoulders squared, carrying some invisible armor against subjugation. She looked white people directly in the eye, a dangerous transgression. At 2, she wandered into the main house and sat at the piano. The sound she coaxed from the keys was no random noise but an almost melodic curiosity, a mystery even to her mother. The overseer, Garrett, whose cruelty was notorious, wanted to whip her. Tall, sun-weathered, and merciless, he reached for his coiled whip, saying, "Let this one think she's special, and she'll be trouble her whole life. Better teach her now what she is." But he stopped. Later he told others he had felt sudden, constricting chest pain, a sharp band tightening around his ribs, and for a moment thought he was dying. Once he turned away from her amber-flecked eyes, the pain vanished, leaving unease. He never touched Zora again, though he punished Celia in retaliation, extending her labor and reducing her rations. Celia knew they couldn't remain. She sensed gradually, then all at once, that this child would not survive the plantation's slow violence. At 5, Zora's strangeness was the subject of whispered talk in both the quarters and the main house. The enslaved community regarded her with reverence and fear. White people sensed something they couldn't name, something that disrupted the order they believed natural. Strange things happened around Zora. Tracking dogs would circle and refuse commands. White overseers would develop sudden, unbearable headaches. Locks mysteriously opened, allowing the enslaved to secure food during lean months. Once, an overseer's horse threw him violently when he tried to strike Zora. Rue, now a grandmother figure, began teaching Zora deliberately how to read nature's signs, navigate by stars, identify plants, use herbs to heal or harm, and speak prayers predating the master's imposed Christianity. She taught her charms, protective rituals, and most dangerously, that she was not property, that the world the masters built was human-made and could be unmade. Zora absorbed everything with instinctive understanding. She could identify plants by touch in darkness, sense approaching danger, and dream of events that would later occur. Other children avoided her, unnerved by her intensity. The years dragged on with the grinding monotony of plantation life. Labor, scarce food, casual cruelty, systematic degradation. But beneath it, Zora's powers deepened. The turning point came in autumn 1861. The Civil War had begun, and Whitmore's sons left to fight. Fewer overseers and increasing chaos slightly widened escape possibilities. But patrols intensified, and punishment for running became more savage. A man from a neighboring plantation had been caught trying to reach Union lines, his body displayed at the crossroads for 3 days as a warning. Celia knew they had to leave before Zora came under full predatory attention. At 10, she was no longer a child, yet not fully grown. Garrett's gaze had begun to unsettle Celia, triggering memories of her own exploitation. She would never let it happen to her daughter. On a moonless October night, Celia and Zora fled. Zora had woken with a repeated vision of men, dogs, blood, and Garrett's triumphant face. "We have to leave now," she insisted. They took almost nothing. A small sack of hoarded cornmeal, a sharpened knife, and a small bag Rue pressed into Zora's hands, containing roots, herbs, bones, and symbols Zora instinctively understood. Rue whispered, "You have your grandmother's gift. Don't let them make you forget." 2 hours after midnight, they slipped from the quarters, moving east into swamps and marshlands rather than the usual northward route. The water would hide them, Zora insisted. Wading into the St. John's River as dawn thinned the darkness, they let the gentle current carry them, hands pushing off banks, feet occasionally touching the soft mud. Old Isaiah noticed their absence but delayed raising the alarm, buying them a critical hour. By the time Garrett and Whitmore discovered the escape, Celia and Zora had entered labyrinthine marshes, channels too deep to wade and too shallow to swim, a landscape designed to swallow and never return. The slave catchers were summoned, led by Silas Crenshaw, a brutal professional with 6 trained bloodhounds. Tall, clean-shaven, gray-eyed, he had been hunting humans for 20 years. Arriving at the Whitmore plantation, he listened to Garrett's report with partial attention, scanning the quarters, calculating distances. "How long have they been gone?" he asked flatly. 7, maybe 8 hours, Garrett replied. Crenshaw examined the cabin, touching items that held Celia's scent. Satisfied, he mounted, dogs straining at their leashes. "We'll have them by nightfall. Woman and child can't outrun dogs or horses. It's just a matter of time." But they didn't know they were hunting Zora. The child with amber-flecked eyes, trained in the old ways, carrying protective charms, capable of sensing danger before it arrived. The dogs followed the trail to the river, noses pressed to the ground, bodies quivering with purpose, unaware of the extraordinary force they were pursuing. The moment his knife severed the cord holding the charm to the branch, Crenshaw felt the air shift around him. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a tightening in his chest and a sudden chill crawling along his spine. The birds that had been chirping earlier fell silent. Even the distant rustle of water seemed paused, as if the marsh itself had been holding its breath. He shivered and looked around, suddenly aware that the dense trees and dark water surrounding him felt different, more alive, more watchful. Boggs muttered under his breath, cursing softly, the kind of sound born from superstition and fear. He refused to continue, insisting they camp until morning. But Crenshaw, driven by pride and the thought of the bounty, pushed forward, leading his horse deeper into the marsh. Every step seemed heavier than the last, the mud clinging to hooves and boots as though the swamp were actively resisting their passage. Branches snagged clothing, roots snagged boots, and the water seemed colder, darker, almost viscous in its resistance. By mid-afternoon, Crenshaw realized something unsettling. The trail, the footprints, the broken branches, even the scraps of cloth, were no longer mere signs of passage. They seemed deliberate, choreographed, guiding them exactly where Zora wanted. He knew, somewhere deep in his mind, that these were no ordinary runaways. He had chased desperate mothers with children before, but never with cunning like this, never with signs laid so perfectly to confuse, delay, and unsettle. Miles away, Celia and Zora had moved quietly from their island refuge, traveling along narrow hammocks and hidden water channels. Zora's energy seemed inexhaustible, her amber-flecked eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She moved with precision, avoiding patches of mud that would slow them, guiding her mother with instincts that seemed almost supernatural. Every so often she paused, muttering words low and urgent, arranging small talismans, roots, bones, a lock of her own hair, into intricate patterns along their path, subtle markers for those who might be watching, as if the marsh itself obeyed her command. That night, as they rested beneath the branches of a cypress, Zora whispered to her mother, explaining her strategy. "I'm sending them visions again, Mama," she said quietly, her hands moving in deliberate patterns over the charms. "Not just to scare them, but to confuse them, to make them think the swamp itself is against them. Every sound they hear, every shadow they see, is a message. I make them doubt their senses, doubt their own judgment. I make them afraid." Celia watched her daughter with awe and terror, recognizing the power that had always set Zora apart. It was a dangerous gift, one that could protect them but also drain her, leave her exhausted and vulnerable. Yet the child carried it naturally, instinctively, channeling knowledge passed down from generations before her, ancestral wisdom that survived centuries of violence and oppression. Meanwhile, Crenshaw and his remaining men had made camp on a narrow hammock of solid ground, uneasy and restless. One of the remaining hounds whimpered incessantly, its ears flat, eyes wide with fear. Boggs fumed quietly, unsettled by shadows that moved in the corner of his vision, by sounds that couldn't be explained. He swore he saw the girl standing in the water just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching them. When he pointed and shouted, there was nothing. Crenshaw told himself it was fatigue, nerves, imagination, but deep down, a seed of doubt took root. The next day, the hunt became chaotic. The ropes that had tied the dogs overnight were untied, the knots carefully loosened. The hounds refused to track, shying away from footprints and mud that should have been obvious to them. One of the men, Porter, complained of a sudden excruciating headache, doubled over in his saddle until the pain vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived. Trees and branches seemed to shift subtly in their path. The footprints they followed appeared and disappeared, as if the earth itself had been rearranged. Every attempt to predict the runaway's path failed, and every hour spent chasing them increased the hunter's unease. By mid-morning, Crenshaw spotted a small charm hanging from a low branch. Bones, feathers, and twisted strands of hair fashioned into an unfamiliar shape. Boggs refused to approach it, insisting it was a warning. Crenshaw dismounted and cut it down himself. The moment the knife severed the ties, the swamp seemed to respond. The wind shifted, a shiver passed through the trees, and an eerie silence settled over the marsh. His hands trembled slightly, a rare acknowledgment of fear that he could not voice. He knew instinctively that this was no ordinary pursuit. Something about the girl, about the charms, the strange occurrences, the uncanny precision with which she manipulated their perception, suggested forces he had been trained to dismiss his entire life. Stories of hoodoo and conjure, always relegated to superstition, now seemed uncomfortably plausible. This girl, barely 10, was orchestrating events, controlling shadows, bending perception, using knowledge centuries old to protect herself and her mother. Crenshaw pushed on, but each step felt heavier. Every twist and turn, every inexplicable phenomenon eroded his confidence. He could feel the shift, the hunters becoming the hunted. The swamp itself seemed alive, watching, waiting, guided by unseen hands. The prey they thought helpless was not only surviving but manipulating the hunt, shaping it to their advantage. Far ahead, hidden beneath a canopy of interwoven branches, Celia and Zora rested briefly. Zora arranged another circle of bones and herbs, twisting a lock of her hair with Spanish moss, whispering words that seemed older than the world around them. She closed her eyes, still as stone, sending visions, fear, and uncertainty into the minds of those pursuing them. When she opened them, her face was pale from effort, but resolute. "I've sent them doubt," she told her mother. "They'll hesitate, they'll question themselves. It won't stop them, but it will buy us time." Celia nodded silently, understanding that her daughter's power was a weapon born of necessity, a counter to a world that had treated them as property, as tools to be used and discarded. "Is it wrong?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Zora shook her head. "They made me property, Mama. They told me I wasn't human. They used fear and violence every day. This is just using what I have to fight back, to survive, to protect us." That night, the swamp seemed to hum with quiet energy. The hunters camped nearby were restless, uneasy, shadows twisting in ways that made even Crenshaw second-guess himself. By dawn, they would continue the pursuit, but the momentum had shifted. What had started as a hunt was no longer simple tracking. The mother and child were shaping the terrain, controlling perception, turning every instinct the hunters had against them. For the first time in decades, Crenshaw understood the limits of his power, and for the first time, fear took root in his seasoned heart. The morning sun rose over the Union camp, soft and golden, cutting through the lingering mist that clung to the trees and river banks. Celia stirred first, careful not to wake Zora, who slept curled against her, her small chest rising and falling with untroubled breaths. Outside, the camp was alive with activity. Soldiers prepared for patrols, horses stamped impatiently in their stalls, and the distant sounds of artillery reminded everyone that the war still raged beyond these temporary havens. Celia rose slowly, rubbing the stiffness from her legs, and watched her daughter sleep a moment longer. There was a fierce peace in this sight, a quiet affirmation that despite the unimaginable horrors of the past weeks, they had survived. They had crossed a river that once marked the line between slavery and freedom, and now they were beyond it, legally and, more importantly, spiritually. Yet freedom was not a destination. It was the beginning of another journey. Zora would need rest to recover the strength her powers had drained, and Celia would need to learn how to live without constant fear, how to navigate a world that still judged her by the color of her skin. But for now, the most important fact remained. They were alive, and they were free. Word of Zora's abilities had spread quickly through the camp, whispers turning to stories and stories into legend. Some soldiers treated her with awe, others with suspicion. Yet she remained unchanged by their attention, quiet, reserved, vigilant. Her powers had been tools of survival, not trophies to display. And as Celia watched, she realized that the greatest gift her daughter possessed was not the magic she wielded, but the wisdom to use it only when necessary. Over the next days, they were registered as contraband, given identification papers that proclaimed their freedom, and offered assistance in finding safe quarters or employment. The Union Army, while imperfect, provided a structured sanctuary. Celia and Zora joined other freed families, hearing fragments of news from distant battles, learning about the shifting tides of war, and slowly beginning to understand what life in freedom might truly require. Celia often caught herself watching Zora, who now walked among other children with a quiet confidence. Her eyes no longer simply reflected the fear and exhaustion of flight. They gleamed with purpose, intelligence, and the legacy of generations of people who had survived because they refused to yield. The magic that had saved them in the marshes had not vanished. It had become a part of her, a reminder of the power of knowledge, ancestry, and courage. They spoke rarely of the horrors behind them. There was little need. The memory of the marsh, of the ghostly shapes, of the fear and cruelty they had faced, remained vivid enough. What mattered was moving forward, taking each step as free people, and discovering how to live in a world that had long denied them humanity. And yet, even as they began this new chapter, the story of Zora, the girl who turned slave catchers into shadows, continued to grow beyond them. Soldiers would tell others, townspeople would whisper, and the enslaved communities further south would pass her tale along in secret. With every retelling, she became larger than life, a symbol of resistance, a promise that courage could flourish even in the darkest times. Celia understood that this was more than legend. It was survival, it was memory, and it was hope. In a nation divided by war and cruelty, the story of a mother and her child refusing to surrender, of magic and cunning triumphing over oppression, would endure. And Zora, she would grow into her gifts, learning to control and understand them, carrying not only the legacy of her ancestors but the story of her own courage. For now, though, the child slept, the mother watched, and for the first time in years, the world felt wide, full of possibility, and truly, genuinely free. Freedom was theirs, and nothing, not even the darkest powers of oppression, could take that away. Weeks passed in the Union camp, and life began to settle into a fragile rhythm. Celia and Zora learned the routines of free people, meals provided without fear of theft, beds that were theirs to keep, and voices that spoke to them as equals rather than property. Yet the scars of slavery ran deep. Every sound, every shadow, still carried echoes of the marsh, of Crenshaw's rifle, of the shapes that had pursued them through the darkness. Celia often held Zora close at night, whispering reminders that they were safe now, even as the child trembled from memories she could barely name. Zora's powers, while still raw, began to manifest in subtler ways. She could sense danger before it arrived, a presence in the camp that didn't belong, She could coax hidden food animals toward them when rations ran low. And, most impressively, she could influence people's perception, small things at first, a glance that made a soldier hesitate, a gesture that guided someone's thoughts away from suspicion. Celia marveled at her daughter's abilities, but she also worried. Every use drained Zora, and the child was still growing, still learning the limits of her gifts. The other freed people in the camp were drawn to her. They whispered stories of the girl who had walked through the marshes and survived, who had made the impossible happen. Older women nodded approvingly when they heard her name. Men offered quiet respect, and even children gathered near her, sensing the aura of something extraordinary. Zora did not boast. She did not seek attention. She accepted their curiosity with quiet dignity, knowing that her powers were tools of survival, not of spectacle. Celia worked to reclaim pieces of her own life, writing letters to friends and family she had lost contact with, learning how to navigate the bureaucracy that now recognized her as a person rather than property, and finding moments of peace to remind herself that fear no longer ruled her days. She also became a mentor of sorts to the other women in camp, teaching them ways to survive, to resist, and to assert their new rights in a world that had long denied them. But even in freedom, danger lingered. Confederate raids were still a threat in nearby regions, and rumors spread of slave catchers who had survived the marshes, determined to reclaim their lost property. Celia and Zora never let their guard down entirely. Every movement was measured, every step taken with awareness, yet they no longer lived in the paralyzing terror of the past. Now they could act, not just react. One afternoon, Zora approached Celia, her luminous eyes steady and focused. "Mama, I think I understand something," she said softly. "The marsh, it gave me power, but it also gave me fear. And now that I'm not running, I can use what I learned to protect us, to help others, not just hide from danger." Celia smiled, pride and relief mingling in her chest. "That's right, baby. You survived the worst they could throw at us. Now you can take that strength and shape a life that belongs to you, and maybe even help others find their own freedom along the way." Zora nodded, her small hand gripping her mother's. For the first time, she seemed at peace with who she was, with the legacy she carried and the power that had once terrified both her and her enemies. Stories of her deeds continued to spread beyond the camp. Soldiers told them to civilians, civilians whispered them to travelers, and enslaved communities far to the south began to hold Zora's tale close, a symbol of resistance, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of those determined to survive. And so the mother and daughter began to build their new lives, not just surviving, but living, learning what it meant to be free in a world that had long denied them that basic human right. They healed in increments, found joy in small things, and discovered the profound truth that freedom was not only an act of escape, it was an act of becoming. Zora, once a child of fear and oppression, was now a child of possibility. She was legend, survivor, and protector. And through her, Celia understood that freedom was not just about leaving the past behind. It was about carrying the lessons of survival forward, transforming trauma into power, and ensuring that the story of their courage would never be forgotten. Even as the war raged on, even as challenges awaited them beyond the horizon, Celia and Zora had already won the most important battle. They had claimed their right to live, to exist, and to be free. And in that victory, they discovered a truth that could never be taken away. Freedom, once seized, belongs to no one but the one who dares to claim it. The days turned into weeks, and the Union camp became a place of stability for Celia and Zora. Soldiers moved with purpose, schedules were maintained, and the constant fear that had dominated their lives began to ebb. Yet the echoes of the past remained, a reminder that freedom was not simply a change in location. It was a constant effort to claim one's life, one choice, one breath at a time. Zora's powers, once a weapon of survival, began to transform into a tool for healing and guidance. She learned to focus her abilities, guiding lost travelers through forests, helping others avoid Confederate patrols, and quietly protecting those too weak to defend themselves. Her luminous eyes, once terrifying to enemies, became a symbol of hope to those around her. People began to speak of her not as a child, but as a guardian, a young woman with the wisdom of someone who had faced death and emerged stronger. Celia worked alongside her daughter to rebuild their lives. She registered formally with the Union Army as a freedwoman, gaining documentation that recognized her humanity and her rights. She began teaching literacy to others in the camp, sharing what she had learned from stolen moments of reading on the plantation, and helping former slaves understand that knowledge, like freedom, was a form of power. But even in this newfound stability, Celia knew the world was not yet fully safe. Stories of Zora's deeds had spread far and wide, reaching the ears of former slave catchers and skeptics alike. Yet the fear that had once driven men like Crenshaw into the marshes now worked in her daughter's favor. Zora had become more than flesh and bone. She was legend. Every tale told about the girl who could summon shadows, bend perception, and call upon the spirits of the dead served as a shield. The people who had hunted them dared not approach again, and the enslaved communities whispered her story to keep their own courage alive. One afternoon, as they walked along a sunlit path through the forest beyond the camp, Zora paused and looked up at her mother. "Mama," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we've survived everything they tried to do to us, but now we have a choice. We can hide or we can step into the world and shape it." Celia squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the weight and promise in her words. "We shape it, baby. That's the power we've been given. The freedom to decide, the courage to act, and the strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves." And so they did. Over the following months, Celia and Zora traveled north with other freed people, moving toward cities where opportunities were real, where they could live openly as free individuals. Zora continued to hone her powers, learning to control them with precision, always mindful of the cost they exacted. Celia, ever vigilant, ensured that her daughter's extraordinary abilities were never used frivolously, only when necessary to protect life or claim justice. The tale of Zora became intertwined with the larger story of emancipation, a legend passed down in whispers and songs. In the decades that followed, her deeds inspired countless others, a reminder that resistance was not only possible but necessary, and that courage, even in the smallest bodies, could topple the largest oppressors. Children learned her story, women and men carried it in their hearts, and for those who had been enslaved, it became a symbol that freedom was not given, it was claimed, fought for, and earned. As the years passed, Celia and Zora built a life in a city where they could live openly, work, and contribute to their communities. Zora never stopped being extraordinary, but she also grew into the quiet strength of ordinary life, learning, teaching, loving, and remembering the marshes where her power had first been tested. Celia watched her daughter with pride, knowing that the child who had been hunted, who had faced death in the form of men and spirits alike, had become a woman of wisdom, courage, and unbreakable spirit. The story of the girl who turned slave catchers to shadows became more than history. It became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unyielding fight for freedom. And in every telling, the truth remained. A mother and daughter, bound by love and survival, had claimed what the world had tried to deny them. They were free. And in that freedom, they had found not only life, but the power to change the world around them, one choice at a time. The legend of Zora endured, as all true stories of courage do, not just in books or whispered tales, but in the lives of those who were inspired to resist, to survive, and to claim their own freedom, no matter the odds. And in that, The journey of a mother and her daughter became timeless, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest times, light, unyielding, fierce, and powerful, could emerge from the smallest, most unexpected places. The story of Zora and her mother Celia teaches that freedom and justice are earned through courage, resilience, and the refusal to be defined by oppression. Even in the face of overwhelming danger and systemic cruelty, the human spirit can find strength in ingenuity, love, and solidarity. True power is not measured by domination or violence, but by the ability to protect, survive, and uplift others. It also reminds us that resistance takes many forms, sometimes through open defiance, sometimes through clever strategy, and sometimes through the quiet use of gifts to safeguard life. The smallest voices, the seemingly powerless, can change the course of history when they act with intelligence, bravery, and moral clarity. Ultimately, the story teaches that freedom is more than a legal status. It is the reclamation of one's agency, dignity, and the right to live fully as a human being. And that legacy, when passed down, becomes a light for others to follow, inspiring generations to believe that injustice can be challenged and overcome.